네, 여러분 즐거운 오후 보내고 계시죠? 전북국제금융컨퍼런스에 함께해 주신 모든 분들 진심으로 환영합니다. 먼저 인사드리겠습니다. 저는 이 자리 진행을 맡은 아나운서 장선영입니다. 대단히 반갑습니다. 네, 고맙습니다. 소중한 시간 내어서 이렇게 함께해 주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 진심으로 감사 인사를 드립니다. 전북특별자치도 그리고 국민연금공단, 전주시가 공동으로 주최하는 전북국제금융컨퍼런스 올해 6번째로 함께하고 계신데요. 국내외 금융산업을 이끌고 계신 리더들을 모시고 세계 경제와 산업의 트렌드도 짚어보고요. 또 이 변화에 따라서 우리 지역의 대응을 모색하는 자리로 준비를 하고 있습니다. 뿐만 아니라 우리 지역 금융이 어떤 현명한 역할들을 해나갈 수 있을지 다양한 해법을 찾는 자리이기도 한데요. 특히 이번 컨퍼런스에서는 인공지능을 활용한 자산 운용 그리고 리스크 관리라는 주제로 여러 전문가분들의 발표와 토론이 진행될 예정입니다. 인사이트 나누는 뜻깊은 시간 되셨으면 좋겠습니다. 자, 저희 본격적인 시작에 앞서서 오늘 이 자리 함께해 주신 내빈분들을 먼저 한 분 한 분 소개해 드리면서 시작해 보도록 하겠습니다. 제가 소개해 드리면 여러분 따뜻한 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. 자, 먼저 오늘 이 자리 김종훈 전북특별자치도 경제부지사님 참석해 주셨습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시고요. 네, 다음은 문승우 전북특별자치도의회 의장님 소개해 드립니다. 네, 반갑습니다. 윤동욱 전주시 부시장님 소개드리겠습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시고요. 김진만 국민연금공단 경영지원실장님 소개드리겠습니다. 네, 반갑습니다. 윤여봉 전북경제통상진흥원장님 소개드리겠습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시기 바랍니다. 네, 이어서 박현주 BNY 한국대표님 소개드립니다. 네, 박수 보내주시죠. 임세희 금융감독원 전국제협력국장님 소개해드리겠습니다. 네, 반갑습니다. 임형조 금융감독원 전북지원장님 참석해 주셨습니다. 이어서 김건 한국핀테크지원센터 이사장님 소개드립니다. 네, 박수 보내주시고요. 다음은 퀀tit 한덕기 대표님 소개드리겠습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시죠. 자, 이어서 블랙락의 제럴드 가비 매니징 디렉터님 소개해드리겠습니다. Yes, please welcome. Thank you very much. 네, 다음은 알리안츠 글로벌 인베스터즈 요르크 허프만 퀀트 리서치 총괄님 소개해드리겠습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시죠. Please welcome. Thank you. 네, 이어서 웰링턴 투자상품 펀드 전략 부문 투자 디렉터이신 필립 브룩스님 소개해드리겠습니다. 박수 보내주시기 바랍니다. Thank you very much. 네, 그리고 피델리티 인터내셔널의 조한머 글로벌 퀀트 총괄님 소개해드리겠습니다. Please welcome. 네, 이어서 퀀텟의 박성민 이사님 소개해드리겠습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시죠. 네, 고맙습니다. 자, 저희가 오늘 컨퍼런스에서 본격적인 논의를 시작하기 전에 오늘 함께해 주신 분들을 먼저 모시고 기념사진 촬영을 하면서 시작을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 제가 안내드리면 안내에 따라서 등단을 부탁을 드리겠습니다. 자, 먼저 김종훈 전북특별자치도 경제부지사님, 그리고 문승우 전북특별자치도 의회 의장님, 윤동욱 전주부시장님, 김진만 국민연금공단 경영지원실장님, 네 분 먼저 단상으로 자리를 해주시고요. 자, 그리고 블랙락 제럴드 가비 매니징 디렉터님, could you please come up to the stage? 네, 그리고 주식회사 퀀텟의 한덕기 대표님, 박성민 이사님, 네, please. 다음은 BNY 한국 대표 박현주 대표님, 그리고 웰링턴 한국 대표이신 김범부 대표님, 피델리티 인터내셔널 조한머 글로벌 퀀트 총괄님, 알리안츠 글로벌 인베스터즈 요르크 허프만님, 웰링턴 투자상품 펀드 전략 부문 투자 디렉터이신 필립 브룩스님, 그리고 블랙락 투자총괄 헨리 쉔님, 피델리티 황미정 기관영업본부장님, 그리고 알리안츠 김광수 상무님까지 단상 위쪽으로 모시겠습니다. 네, 안내에 따라서 위쪽으로 자리해 주시고요. 네, 제가 있는 이쪽으로 모시겠습니다. 네, 고맙습니다. Thank you very much. 네, 좋습니다. 네, 저희가 멋진 사진을 위해서 네, 도움을 부탁을 드리겠습니다. 자, 정면에 카메라 봐주시고요. Please look at the camera. 네, 좋습니다. 자, 활짝 웃는 미소 부탁을 드리겠습니다. Smile please. 네, 여러분 큰 박수 보내주시죠. 네, 박수 치는 포즈로 한번 찍도록 하겠습니다. 네, 카메라 봐주시고요. 3, 2, 1. 자, 다른 포즈가 혹시 필요하십니까? 괜찮으십니까? 하트. 네, 좋습니다. It's Korean heart like this. 네. Thank you very much for your cooperation. 네, 자, please look at the camera. 네, 여러분 다시 한번 사진 촬영을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 보내주시죠. 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. Please take your seats. 네, 자리에 착석을 부탁을 드리겠습니다. 네, 오늘 이 자리가 있기까지 또 오늘 이 시간 컨퍼런스에 많은 도움을 주실 분들 한 자리 모시고 저희가 사진 촬영으로 진행을 했는데요. 자, 그럼 지금부터는 본격적인 논의의 장을 열어보도록 하겠습니다. 자, 먼저 기조 강연으로 이 시간 시작을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 자, 이번 컨퍼런스의 주제 앞서서 설명을 드렸던 것처럼 인공지능을 활용한 자산 운용과 리스크 관리에 대해서 이야기를 나눠볼 예정인데요. 먼저 오늘 기조 강연에서는 블랙락의 제럴드 가비 매니징 디렉터께서 준비를 해주셨습니다. AI 기술을 활용한 알파 수익 창출이라는 아주 흥미로운 주제로 준비를 해주셨는데요. 응용 미시 경제학을 토대로 기업과 산업 또 국가 차원의 기업 전략까지 넓은 범위에서 연구를 하고 계시죠. 어떤 인사이트 나눠주실지 저희는 단상으로 모시고 이야기 듣도록 하겠습니다. So now could you please come up to the stage? The floor is yours. 네, 위쪽으로 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. 큰 박수 보내주시죠. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. Many of us have been to Korea many times, but almost exclusively in Seoul. So it's absolutely delightful to see a little bit more of the country and countryside on the way as well. I look forward to talking a little bit more about this region, hopefully at our panel as well. So the topic for today is we are not the conference is on both asset management and risk management, and that clearly includes many different asset classes. Today I'm going to focus exclusively on alpha delivery in equities. So just because I only have half an hour and we don't have time to cover everything, so we'll narrow it down a little bit. You won't hear much about risk, and you won't hear much about fixed income or crypto or anything aside the enormous equity markets. Let's see. So first thing is the most important. We're actually our team, which is BlackRock Systematic, is on a bit of a world tour this year, and that is actually celebrating the 40th anniversary of our oldest actively managed fund. This is actually quite rare. I probably don't have to tell an audience this experienced that that's actually quite rare. A very common thing in asset management instead is to start up a fund that is on some topic or theme that is currently hot and then shut it down when it becomes less hot and reopen something else. We've been running one of these funds continuously since 1985. And since it's still alive, you can probably guess that it has reasonable performance. It was also it's also benchmarked to a market where many people don't believe that alpha delivery is even possible. That is, it is actually an S&P 500 benchmarked strategy. We chose that benchmark in 1985 because that's what was available at the time. I don't think we have any other reason for not going global or not going smaller cap. That's what we had. The core of what we do, or at least did, and certainly the risk part of it, is summarized in this wonderful textbook called Active Portfolio Management. The two authors, the first author, Richard Grinold, is one of the founders of Barra Asset Management. He's retired. The second author, Ronald Kahn, is still with our group. He's been with our group almost since the inception. He's been there since 1999. I've actually been with the group since 2004, and despite the way that some of us look, we're actually quite a young team. I'm the second oldest person on the team, and we have a lot of people in their 20s and 30s. The things that we bring in particular to the new artificial intelligence-based asset management is, first off, an investment philosophy that's extremely compatible with the use of technology and advanced techniques, because we've always been using techniques that were advanced at the time. In fact, the Grinold and Kahn book really summarizes what was cutting edge 20 years ago. And I would also say my colleague and the head of our group, Raffaele Savi, and I have been teaching a class in the UC Berkeley Master of Financial Engineering program for 4 years based on this book. Ron taught the course for 17 years. What I will tell you, a very simple AI story. You don't buy the book because it's wonderful to have on your shelf, but also if you have trouble reading it or following it because it was written by real live people in real live time, sometimes the notation isn't perfect and changes a bit. Modern LLMs, even the first ChatGPT, understands this book beautifully. We don't teach the book much anymore because AI teaches the book better than we ever can. If anybody has a question about the book, just ask the large language model. It's almost frightening how good and how clear the answers are. It can go through the Greek notation, tell you when we change it. It can interpret. It's amazing. So just a feeling for how powerful this technology has become. So we've run this thing for 40 years, but we've only run it that long by being constantly on the look for new ideas and new insights. And for us, really, if you've ever heard the funny English term watershed, it refers really to a time where, close to speaking, the dam breaks. You're accumulating a lot of water, and all of a sudden something changes, and you really have to change what you do. And what it really did for us, and not all asset managers have followed this track. This was really our decision. That's the wonderful thing about the asset management industry. In addition to the people at the table with me and all around, there's room for many different approaches. We focus exclusively on that little yellow box, which is what we call pure alpha. And the way we get to pure alpha, because this is something you have to calculate, this is not something you can use to buy beer, is first off, investment return. That's what you can use to get the unlimited beer apparently they serve here from 6 to 10 p.m. That's what you use actual dollars or won to do that. Much of that, when we do this in equities, comes from the index, which is almost always a market capitalization weighted return. Although some of our more innovative clients, especially in the Asia area, actually have benchmarks that are somewhat more sophisticated than that. If you just use that, then your simple alpha is the difference between whatever returns you earn and the returns on the benchmark. Some of our clients have recognized that since about 2010, many investment styles that we used to think were cutting edge and clever are now available in commodity form through exchange-traded funds at very low fees. We call that, when it was hot, it was called smart beta. I believe now people just call it factors, but we all know what it means. This is the kind of thing you can find on Ken French's data website if you ever want to play with it. This is value and size and momentum and profitability and anything that you can calculate straightforwardly. And we focus exclusively on returns that are not driven by those factors. That's really what alpha means to us. And you can think about this either as an attempt just to do it because it's interesting. It's a lot more fun, especially for those of us like me who aren't very good at implementation, which is the game really with smart beta. It's also just more interesting because you know you can't pick up returns doing that. You must get your returns the other way. The other way to think about it, I find this more acceptable as an economist, is just an old-fashioned competition. You can buy exposure to smart beta for 10 basis points. We are not a high fee manager, but we charge more than 10 basis points for most of our products, and we should not be charging 10 basis points for exposure to beta or to anything that you might want that you can get for a lot less than active fees. So we have focused exclusively on pure alpha. Now, one thing that happened with our group is right around that same time, and it may well have been luck. Many of us in the finance industry probably weren't feeling very lucky in 2009, probably feeling like the heavens hated us, which maybe they did. But we also ended up with a small team of people that called themselves data scientists. These were close to aliens at that time. I'm from a traditional economics and eventually finance and accounting background, and these are people, as we now know, who were driven entirely by the availability of data, the ability to process data, the ability to use advanced algorithms to extract information from this kind of data. And in the old-fashioned corporate strategy world, sometimes people talk about the learning curve or the experience curve, where you simply start out not really knowing what you're doing, and eventually, over time, you learn what you're doing. This was really important for us at the human scale, because for the first few years, we did not understand or trust each other, simply put. It took a long time for them to understand us and us to understand them, and nowadays, we don't really even have a distinction. So, first off, the first thing we have a whole team that simply sources new data. And in fact, about half of our new research projects and ideas come from that. So they're not really so much new ideas. They're more like, wow, I've always wanted to know which companies are looking to hire people, where they're looking to hire people, what kind of skills they're looking for to hire people, how much they're offering to pay in different regions for people. We always wanted to see that information. When I was growing up as a labor economist, the only thing we could measure was the total number of employees at a company. And even that isn't a very good measure, because that's only the full-time employees, not subcontractors, suppliers, and customers. And the pay of the top 5 executives. And for most of the companies in our large cap benchmark, that isn't all that interesting. Most of the action comes from people below the executive suite, and now we can measure them. We then have to use technology to process this kind of data, because it is overwhelming. One of the most basic things about it is much of the time the information isn't even directly tagged with a company ticker. The first thing you have to ask is, who is this data actually about? What investable product does this actually refer to? And then finally, once you've got the information processed, tagged to assets, give you a view on the assets, you then have to actually put it into portfolios and change the portfolios every day, and sometimes intraday. And that's where our trading platforms have been incredibly helpful. And this is not, one of the ways that we've actually started to use technology is also to simply do a lot of what we call internal crossing, which is simply taking advantage of the fact that we have a massive amount of funds that are not run the same way our funds are run. And so very often they will want to do a trade where we will want to take the other side, and we can do that trade very easily. So this is just a very simple summary of the innovations and the changes we have made in our models in the 40 years that this fund has been running. The lower chart summarizes in a very, very crude form what's happened. I think this is quite common nowadays in the asset management world. We think about our views on stocks as being comprised of individual signals, which are simply data analyzed and summarized to a one-dimensional column of scores or numbers that applied to companies. We standardize it so a 3 is the very best you can be on that dimension, and a -3 is the very worst you can be. And a 0 reflects either that you're average or, as often happens, we just don't have that data item for you. When we started counting this stuff in around the early 2010s, we had about 200 features. Sometimes, I jumped that jargon. I showed you my tech colleagues. They refer to these things as features. We call them signals. So you might say a signal is a feature that has a sign on it. So it's not just something about a company, but it's something where more is good and less is bad. We're now up to over 1,000, and this is these 1,000 signals are used to manage over $200 billion in active assets, and the amount of information that we extract every day is enormous. But interestingly, when we started, the top line of this timeline is actually the signals and ideas by broad category. And the bottom chart are the products and the new implementation vehicles that have come along with it. On the bottom, you can see a great deal of this it's nice to be able to say this here, was moving out from US large cap into all the other pockets of equities that are out there in the world. And now we manage equities entirely globally. Our biggest strategies are simply global. And we also have large regional strategies, Asia Pacific, Europe, world ex-US, et cetera. On the top, the most basic thing we did, and this was actually an innovation in 1985, was actually measuring each and every company in the S&P 500's dividend yield and book-to-price ratio. And back then, that was a big deal. People didn't do that. And we ranked stocks according to that, and we went overweight the good ones and underweight the bad ones. Very quickly, we jumped into using analyst data, and this is in the early days of a service that's now actually hardly even around anymore, called IBIS, that would simply summarize the forecasts, the fundamental forecasts of different sell-side brokers, report them, update them, and we use that information as one of our very first alpha signals. The next one, again, and these things are all quite familiar now, was the earnings quality family. We were actually quite fortunate to be using this kind of information, which really was looking somewhat more deeply at accounting statements below earnings per share and dividends, and asking how much of it is cash, how much of their apparent new earnings simply comes from reinvesting or not expensing items. This was a big deal in the early 2000s because it caught the end of the dot-com boom, the first dot-com boom, and also the accounting scandals with names that some of us old people remember, like Enron and WorldCom. If you simply measured things other than bottom-line earnings, you were actually able to capture these. Again, all of these have now become quite commoditized. You can actually buy earnings quality ETFs for very cheap. Some of the more exciting things that have come in was explicitly around right before 2010, we started using what's called unstructured data. Again, this is all quite familiar to you, which simply means taking information about a company that doesn't come into in numerical form and converting it into numerical form. And a great deal of the innovations that we come through are simply better and better and better ways of making text into numerical form. In fact, a large language model in our setting really just ends up being another way of doing that, an exciting way. We were a very early mover in the ESG world, and we avoided or missed the massive increase in assets managed according to ESG that crested and hit its own peak around 2022 and has gone down since then. We've taken an exclusively alpha-focused approach to that, and in fact, most of our longer horizon insights are in this category. So we actually find a lot of features, use this language again, that people think often are associated with saving the environment and saving the planet, which they sometimes are, as also basic indicators of whether a company is well run. We were one of the first people to uncover the simple fact that having lower emissions for every dollar of sales is actually an indirect indicator of just how efficient you are, not just an indicator of what you're doing to the climate. It also just indicates whether you're good at what you do. More recently, we've been moving into what we call thematics, and we're going to show you how we've actually harnessed, especially the power of large language models, to do this in a way that is substantially more systematic and replicable than the thematic products that you see nowadays. And finally, one of the most beautiful things that we realized about all this new information, the fact that it is not explicitly tagged to a ticker and a company also means that it is not restricted to listed assets. Most of the information that you source in the new digital world doesn't care whether it's a private company, a public company, a government entity, a regulatory body. There are the employee ratings websites include the accounting standards boards and government agencies and private companies as well as listed companies. And so that meant for us is we can also now run systematic strategies and systematic approaches to private markets, because the great 90% of the information that we get is not actually about publicly traded companies, it's about the rest of the world. And if you spend a bit of time taking a systematic approach, you can actually build a model that does things like forecast which companies that are currently private are going to come public. And then it looks a great deal like traditional alpha research. All right. So at the end of the day, the way we view the modern world of investment management and information processing is simply that anything that we can measure, which is almost everything, will be measured and is increasingly become measured. So simply put, the red boxes are what you might call traditional ways of people thinking about information, and the yellow boxes are the ways that we can measure it nowadays. The first one is humans have always been reading news, broker reports, filings with regulators, weblogs, which were really innovative in 2002. And natural language processing allows a machine or allows you to systematically take basically the way people, market participants talk, and summarize it into numbers. Expert networks is a big part of traditional, especially fundamental active asset management, where you ask people who've worked in an industry for a long time what they think. We can source a great deal more than that. We don't have to restrict ourselves to people who've been designated as experts. We can look at everybody. We can pick up information from people who are not currently famous, but who actually often we find have good insights. Instead of going to visit companies in the field, you can also gather information on the ground from satellite imagery. Some of our very first measures of basic economic activity in China took advantage of the fact that one of the easiest things to do for a satellite and for a simple detection device is to identify metal. That's an easy thing to get from the air. And movement of metal, especially in places that do manufacturing or retail, is basically goods and services being transported in trucks and trains. And the amount of that traffic was a very early indicator of just how much economic activity is happening. Government statistics, you've probably seen in the US some of the controversies over especially labor-related statistics, but all the statistics that governments produce. Nowadays, we have alternative ways of measuring this. So instead of asking the not very popular Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US what we believe unemployment is or activity in the labor markets are, we can actually measure companies' job advertisements from personnel records. We can actually identify how many companies are actually hiring people, what they're paying, who's changing jobs, and we can not only get a better read on government statistics, we can get that information in a more timely way. And finally, as we know, my way of thinking about it is if you knew companies' earnings perfectly a year in advance, you would explain less than a third of stock returns. So most of stock returns over any implementable horizon are driven by other things, not even by attempts to forecast future fundamentals, but simply by how much people like the stock or dislike the stock. And instead of viewing that as something to be run away from or complained about, we actually measure that. Simple different search trends, both trends and people's online behavior, not only towards the equities, but towards the products that companies offer, towards the jobs that companies offer. We can now understand how much employees like their job, how satisfied people are with the products that the company is producing, and generate that as a view into the companies. So really, the two biggest advances in modern statistics and data and technology are really advanced natural language processing, and you can really think of large language models as simply the remarkable breakthroughs in this area, basically teaching machines how to read text. This is actually our primary way of using difficult and new data. And the original part that you use, the raw data is just text. And the most basic text that you get is earnings calls, news, broker reports, social media discussions, macro reports. You can now handle almost perfectly different language. Originally, we actually had to have different models and different approaches for different languages. And it may not surprise you to hear that if you especially if you deal in countries where English is not the absolute dominant language, that you actually get quite a different view on equities, on individual stocks, and even across entire markets if you look at what's written in English versus what's written in the local language. And nowadays, large language models can move seamlessly, and so our final views on companies are actually language agnostic. We summarize up the information for what's reported in English, what's reported in Korean, what's reported in Portuguese, and summarize it all into one view. And then finally, what we might call context. This is really what large language models let us do. You probably know this, but it's also often a useful way to think about the evolution of natural language processing. The very, very earliest natural language processing simply started from what's called a dictionary. It simply means you have a list in your hand of happy words and sad words, and then you look through the text and you count up the number of happy words and you subtract the number of sad words and you divide by the total number of words. And that gives you the original, what we'd call sentiment or views. And really natural language processing and now LLMs are a way to really just do that much better. And as you may be aware, especially active management is also a somewhat adversarial business. The dictionary approaches don't work anymore, in part because they're noisy and everybody can do them, but in part because companies know that we're doing it. And the average conference call now includes a lot of happy words relative to sad words because the companies that are answering the question are aware that machines and not just people are reading those transcripts and they change what they do, and that actually invalidates the signal. You can only get information from getting at the truth rather than what people want you to believe. The other important part is once you've got all this information, and the only way to make it happen is to use enormous computing power. With massive computing power, you can first simply implement, as you probably know, the nice way to think about computing power is just, well, power. The sheer amount of power that is consumed in analyzing the data is a good indicator of how much power you're throwing at it. First thing we have to do is we have to combine over 1,000 features into a single one-dimensional view on a stock, because at the end of the day, in active portfolio management, all we can choose is underweight and overweight. Even though the raw information comes in thousands of dimensions, we have to boil it down to a one-dimensional view. We can also then start trading in on different, what some people call regimes, meaning do we want to view signals and companies differently in a world where interest rates are not zero or negative? That's just an example, where labor markets are hot or not hot. And then finally, really what we call portfolio managers in a systematic process are now close to architects. So instead of actually building the portfolio from the beginning, they're more designing and controlling. So first one I'll give you, the first application we have is simply how do we use large language models to extract sentiment from text about companies. So all we're really trying to do is to take massive amounts of text-based information. The most basic ones was simply conference calls, that large yellow bar. Those are very convenient because they come in some countries only twice a year, and in the US at least now 4 times a year. It may go back to twice. We'll adjust if that happens. Take that information, which itself is quite structured, right? The beginning is where the company has the right to tell you what they're thinking, and then later on there will be a question and answer session, and we can actually take that information and bring it in to be structured data. Nowadays, we're starting to use many more different sources of information. A major thing that I'm working right now is actually trying to understand all the credit instruments that companies have. Most large companies also have an extremely complicated set of borrowing and ways of raising finance other than issuing equity. We've actually found that to be incredibly useful. First off, you can read the text of bond covenants, which are additional parts of a bond contract that says either what the company must do or must not do. And as an equity person, instead of saying a bond covenant is good or bad, we ask, what does a presence of a covenant or non-presence of a covenant tell us about the underlying company? We actually found this extremely helpful during some of the troubled ESG world in 2022 to 2024. A major source of underperformance for ESG was actually the massive losses made by alternative energy companies. And those losses were not really driven by low energy prices, because energy prices were not low in those years. It was actually driven by their extremely complicated financing structures. And we were able, with large language models and text, to identify that problem in companies and realize that it actually wasn't so much a problem for the creditors, because the creditors who asked for these covenants understood the problems quite well to understand what the implications were for equity holders at the end of the day. So the fact that the companies had taken on all these complicated obligations, what were the implications for us as equity holders at the very back end of the lineup for who gets paid? The simplest one, if you haven't seen this, is just simply even knowing that the security has a conversion possibility. Means that if the security holders wish and the conditions are satisfied, they now become my fellow shareholders. And I didn't agree to that, but companies issue those securities, and it's really helpful to know that they're out there. Here's really a proof statement for what we've been able to get from this information. The purple line is the cumulative return you would have made from investing a few dollars in traditional analyst revisions. That was actually one of the simplest signals. The logic of it is quite nice and quite standard for systematic investing. The underlying idea is that when analysts increase their earnings forecasts, they tend to do so in a conservative way. Nobody likes to increase their EPS forecast and then later on have to back off and reduce it. If an analyst sees what they think are good news about a company, they tend to slowly incorporate that into their earnings forecasts in order to avoid losing face. But that also means, for a quant like us, that their behavior is predictable. The fact that they made a small revision today makes it very likely that they're going to do another revision in the future. And in the old days, that was actually a source of alpha. But not even by 2012 was it. Everybody understood that. So when an analyst makes a small revision upward, much of the market, or at least the actively traded part of the market, understands this. and actually the stock goes up on its own. The next generation was just, we call it, sometimes the term is bag of words. That's the natural language processing people's word for a dictionary. That means that you just take the image is simply that you forget that the thing actually came from a document that was actually written with a logical structure, and you throw all the words in a bag, and then you pull out the red-coded bad ones and the blue-coded good ones, and you go long them. And that was what we did for a couple years. The second one was really just cleaning out the fact that a lot of the analyst reports that we generate, because sell-side brokers are actually paid according to volume, not only how much trade they can generate, but how many reports they write. And so the very first one was actually just detection of how many of these reports were written by a robot. This is actually kind of an arms race, because as the robots get smarter, you also have to have smarter robots to detect what was written by a robot. But it's still quite powerful. And the subsequent the subsequent developments are all really just ways to get closer and closer to actually reading the document. And what's interesting is you might think that all you're doing is getting closer and closer to replicating what humans already do. And fortunately, at least fortunately for us, no, there's a great deal more to it. The most important thing probably isn't so much speed, because these reports don't come out all that frequently. The most important thing is really consistency. When you and I read something, we have different energy levels, different mood levels. Different people read the report. And you often interpret different texts differently, because after you've read 400 analyst reports, it's just boring. And the machine doesn't get bored. The machine is always hungry for the next report, and it evaluates the report in the same way. The versions 5 and 6 were really bringing in what is called what was cutting edge about 6 years ago in natural language processing, called embeddings, which was really the start of large language models. Embeddings instead has every word represented by a number, so you can perform arithmetical and mathematical operations on it. So king minus man equals queen. That's a simple example of what you could have done with embeddings. Of course, now a large language model does that in a way that's almost human. But even those embeddings are quite powerful. An example for me, which was really quite helpful, was seeing companies' conference calls. We had some old research in ESG where we could find companies that were doing what we call greenwashing, meaning they're claiming to do good things or claiming to be very virtuous, when in fact they were trying to distract you from not very good things they were doing. We actually found that companies' ESG reports actually tend to point you to companies that are in trouble, not companies that are doing good things. But we didn't have that data for a lot of companies. We actually found that if you look at the way that at the embeddings representation of their text, that companies that talk like companies that have guilty consciences that are doing bad things forecast bad things as well as actually having the raw data. So simply the way that an embeddings model could characterize the way companies talk allowed you to get a handle really on how well they're managed. And finally, what we're doing right now is literally a full-on multilingual large language models. And we've been doing that since large language models came out. The basic application here is simply conference call sentiment. And this is literally come in when companies are talking about their earnings. We now have ways of identifying not just the goodness of words, but the context from which those words came, which, as you know, will often can actually change literally from good to bad, whether increasing costs are bad and increasing revenues are good. And if you don't get that right, you're just going to have a very confused view of the word increasing. A more recent one that we found really helpful, especially in the current world where the key drivers of returns and key drivers of people's beliefs are changing so quickly, is actually generating systematically and objectively thematic baskets. So the idea here is quite straightforward. We call it thematic robot, and what it does is it incorporates all this information we'd already taken together from company reports, company conference calls, analyst discussions of companies, news discussions of companies, and we would start off with a human wants to capture something that we have seen important in the markets, and then we ask the machine to identify the stocks that we should hold associated with that theme. Both the winners, those who will do well from a particular theme, and those who will do badly. So here's actually straight into how we do it. So this is a little bit of basic code. So you open up your little portal, and you import the robot. It looks like a module that you'd import in Python like any other module. You set up what are called basket parameters, which is really telling the most important thing for this one is we call temperature, which is really how creative we want the large language model to be. Because at the end of the day, once you tell it what you're interested in, and in this case we were interested in a topic that was rather a big deal at the beginning of this year, is tariffs. Tariffs imposed by the US government on companies and on countries. We wanted to get a sense for which companies might be benefiting from tariffs in the US and which companies might be harmed. And the temperature just tells the model how creative to be. How much do you want to be confident that the companies you're nominating are exactly what you want, or whether you should step back and relax a little bit. Sorry, I hate to ask, how are we doing on time? I don't have a clock up here. Anybody? Okay, thank you. I had a feeling that was the case. Yeah, usually there's a clock. Thank you so much. So we, what came out of this or was quite pleasing is that the most important driver turned out not to be conference calls or text. It actually turned out to be geospatial information. We didn't think about that. We didn't realize that. But when you think about it, I might call this machine teaching, because tariffs are levied by geographical location. And what the model really homed in on was how much do you make in the US versus how much do you sell overseas. And so the most benefited companies are those that were manufacturing in the US and therefore wouldn't face tariff headwinds when they were producing their product, but could turn around and sell overseas. And then you might imagine the next thing you have to do, thematic number 2, is to take into account tariffs that come in the other direction. Finally, augmented investment management, we call it AIM, which is how we then summarize more than 1,000 different views on every stock. What this is actually the original one, which we still use quite extensively here, is simply what's called a trees model, a random forest model to be a little bit more precise. The key thing that lets you do is have a different model for each and every stock. So each and every stock, for some stocks, knowing what their recent returns are is a very important thing. For other stocks, knowing their recent returns is a good thing, but you need to go the other direction. And if you haven't seen this information, a real challenge and a big advance is to then ask, what does this signal do? Because in the old days, it was quite straightforward. I put this signal in at 10% weight, and it likes these companies and hates these companies. So if the companies that it likes does well and the companies that it hates do badly, then that signal did well. Very simple when it's one-dimensional and linear. When it's not like that, because a lot of signals actually end up being mostly contextualizers, meaning knowing this signal means I should look at different signals. So it adds value, but it adds value indirectly. And those plots up there, if you haven't seen them before, are called Shapley contribution plots. And that actually comes from the game theorist Lloyd Shapley in the 1950s, who posed the question, which turns out to be exactly the right question for this purpose. The way I can tell how much you contribute is to ask, how does the model and how does your strategy work without you. So if I took you out and I didn't get to use you in any way at all, then how different would my performance and would my holdings have been? And that's really what these plots summarize. So they summarize, the tails mean that it matters a lot for a small number of stocks, and then the big bulky part tells you that it actually tells you a little bit about a few stocks. This is simply for how our view on Spotify, the podcasting and music platform has evolved over time. And so at the top there, you can see how much of the different signal. It's actually a staircase. So at the very base, you see here's how our view started, and then you walk up and you end up with our current view on the stock, and that then evolves over time. So takeaways are real simple. Scalability. Over 40 years, we've now expanded across asset classes. I mostly talked about equities, but you can apply this. We now have the systematic fixed income team merged in together with our traditional active equity team. Dynamism allows you to change both the model and your views as the world evolves, and it certainly does. And the most important thing is constant innovation, continually not being very satisfied with what you have. And that's a beautiful thing about having the 40-year track record. Here's a simple way to summarize it. We're very proud of this fund. It's still alive. It had a tracking error, or still has a promised tracking error of approximately 2%, and it's generated about 1% alpha on average over that time period, which is wonderful, top quartile, massively sustained. But if you've ever run one of these strategies, it also means that we are right about 52% of the time and wrong 48%. So there's plenty of room to improve what you do. Generate good returns for people, but never become even close to satisfied. Those 48% are a continual reminder that we need to keep working. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Please have a seat. Yes, please. 네, 이렇게 또 다양한 내용들 전해주셨는데요. 지금부터는 전해주신 내용들을 토대로 좀 더 심도 있는 논의, 라운드 테이블 미팅으로 이어가 보도록 하겠습니다. 함께해 주실 분들을 단상으로 소개해 드리죠. 자, 이번 순서 좌장으로는 퀀티드 한덕기 대표님께서 함께해 주시겠고요. The Fidelity International의 조 한모 글로벌 퀀트 총괄님, please come up to the stage. 네, 그리고 알리안츠 글로벌 인베스터즈의 요르크 허프만 퀀트 리서치 총괄님, yes please. 네, 그리고 역시 웰링턴 투자상품 펀드 전략부문 투자 디렉터이신 필립 브룩스님, yes could you please come up to the stage. 네, 그리고 마지막으로 퀀티 박성민 이사님, 네, 위쪽으로 자리해 주시기 바랍니다. Please take your seats. 자, 지금부터는 조금 더 다채로운 이야기들을 통해서 이번 라운드 테이블 세션 풍요롭게 마무리를 해보도록 하겠습니다. 자, 모두 착석을 해주셨는데요. 저는 마이크를 좌장님께 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 부탁드리겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 저는 AI 핀테크 기업 퀀티스의 대표 한덕희입니다. 오늘 이렇게 전주의 글로벌 자산운용사의 리드 그런 그 인사이트를 가지시는 전문가분들을 모시고 이런 AI와 자산운용 그리고 리스크 관리에 대해서 얘기할 수 있게 돼서 매우 영광입니다. 모처럼 어려운 걸음들을 하셨는데 저희가 이분들을 모시고 지금 AI가 실제로 자산운용에 어떠한 기회를 가져다 주는지, 변화를 가져다 주는지, 또는 어떠한 또 위기 요인이 되는지를 조금 더 면밀하게 살펴보는 자리가 되면 좋을 것 같습니다. 오늘 오신 분들이 아까 이제 블랙락에서 먼저 제럴드께서 키노 스피치를 해주셨는데 주식 투자 분야에 있어서 알파들을 블랙락이 어떻게 만들어 왔는지, 그리고 얼마만큼 다양한 데이터셋을 가지고 다양한 테크놀로지를 가지고 그런 시장에서 경쟁 우위를 보여왔는지 굉장히 그 익저스티브하게, 그리고 또 한편으로는 또 함축적으로 잘 또 설명을 해주셔가지고 굉장히 인사이트 있는 그런 세션이었던 것 같습니다. 블랙락 외에도 오늘 오신 분들이 피델리티, 그리고 알리안츠, 웰링턴, 그리고 저희 회사 퀀티스에서도 오셔가지고 각 회사별로 이 AI 시대에 있어서 그 AI 기술들 자산운용에 어떻게 접목하는지를 좀 이제 소개를 부탁드리고자 합니다. 먼저 직접 소개를 부탁드리기 전에 이 AI에 대해서 어떻게 바라봐야 되는지 먼저 조금 말씀을 드리면은 AI라는 단어들은 꽤 오래전부터 있어 왔는데 2022년 말 그 챗GPT가 세상에 이제 공개가 되면서 LLM 모델이 실제로 우리 일상 라이프에 들어오게 됐습니다. 불과 이 블랙락도 아까 이제 40년짜리 그 액티브한 그런 알파 주식 전략에 대해서 말씀을 주셨는데 40년 넘는 이런 자산 운용 역사 안에서 봤을 때는 이 AI 기술이 실제로 그 저변화되고 기술로 도입된 것들은 불과 3년도 채 안 되는 시기입니다. 근데 이 AI가 실제로 기존의 이제 전기처럼 물처럼 이 AI, LLM을 통해서 지능을 기본적인 자원으로 쓸 수 있는 시대가 됐는데 이 시대에서 자산운용사들이 전통적으로 운용해왔던 방식들이 어떠한 그 영향을 미치는지 이것들을 새로운 툴로 보는 건지 자산운용이라는 것들이 이제 전문가가 운용하는 시장인데 이 전문성이 보강되고 인파워링 되는 걸로 보는 건지 아니면 일정 부분 대체하는 걸로 보는 건지 이 안에서의 기존의 이제 자산운용사의 역할들이 어떻게 되는 건지 이런 것들을 살펴볼 수 있는 자리로 만들어 보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 제럴드께서 먼저 그 세션을 소개해 주셔서 다른 회사의 말씀을 좀 들어보고 싶습니다. 먼저 제일 오른쪽에 앉아 계시는 그 피델리티에서 조께서 오셨는데 피델리티에서는 먼저 이제 회사랑 그 소개 간단히 부탁드리고 각 사별로 그 AI를 어떻게 지금 바라보고 있는지 회사 안에서 자산운용에 있어서 어떻게 바라보고 있는지 그리고 실제로 어떻게 도입해서 만약에 이것들을 이제 도입을 했다면 어떻게 도입해서 운용하고 있는지 이런 부분들을 좀 설명을 부탁드리겠습니다. 네.
Yes, thank you very much. And firstly, thank you for inviting me to this conference. Very happy to be here in my first visit to Korea. So looking forward to exploring the culture as well over the next few days. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm from Fidelity International. A lot of you will probably know Fidelity as a very traditional, bottom-up, fundamental house, right? And that is our DNA. That's our building blocks. That's what drives a lot of our investment processes. A lot of the time, when I go and meet clients and introduce myself as the global head of quant, the first reaction is a bit of surprise that we even have a quant team at Fidelity. So we're battling that from the start here today. But I'm here to tell you we've actually had a quant team for a very long time. We've been doing quantitative research as part of our bottom-up process for 25 years. I've been at Fidelity 15 years, and in my current role, I am the head of quantitative research. So we have a cross-asset approach to quant research now. So the team I lead looks after equity, fixed income, and multi-asset research across the organization. And one of the key benefits that we bring, and one of the kind of unique things about Fidelity, is that we combine within this group both the systematic and the discretionary quantitative research. And we think there's a lot of advantages and things that we can leverage in terms of knowledge from different teams, the scalability of implementing models across a wider pool of assets from this approach. So as well as looking at how we can use AI to improve our existing processes, be that an analyst research, the portfolio manager role, the risk team's role, we also are using those same models and approaches to develop and improve our systematic capabilities and the systematic products that we run within our group as well. So that's a unique advantage and a bit of an intro into the setup of the group. To introduce a little bit how we think about AI and how we've approached this problem, obviously the market's moved very fast, the technology's moved very fast, and it's forced people to rethink their approach to not just AI, but to technology overall, right? We'll touch today on insourcing versus outsourcing and how much of this knowledge you need yourselves internally, for example. We've approached this in two main buckets when it comes to AI. One is focusing on the productivity aspect, which will be familiar to a lot of people, and the other is focused on the investment processes and investment signals. And those two buckets of like types of integration of AI, we've looked at in a very different way. So in the productivity space, we've found that that's been a very bottom-up, ground-up implementation, whereas in the investment process space and projects, it's been very much top-down. And maybe I'll just talk a bit about why that is and a few examples of the different projects we've done in each space. So in the productivity space, the type of things we're talking about there are, your chat GPTs, using LLMs in your day-to-day processes to improve your role, either to become more efficient or to produce a higher quality of work. And we very early tried to roll out these tools across the whole organization and empowered everyone with the tools in order to try and find areas across the business that might have the biggest benefit for leveraging them in a more strategic way. And then we did that for almost 2 years, and then we collected all the feedback and ideas from across the company in terms of what impact that could have, and we turned that into a top-down roadmap of how we could institutionalize some of the use cases and some of the interesting ways people had been using the tools across the company. The biggest example of that we've done is introducing a tool called Generator. I'm not sure if the pun translates perfectly into Korean, but it's a combination of how we can do better in terms of content production, particularly on the more client-facing side, using the large language models. Now, that's a key area, and a lot of people, I'm sure, in this room would have played with that in their personal life or in their business life as well. But the key difference or a key advantage is trying to institutionalize the best practices from that into a tool that can be used to make it more repeatable. There's a big learning process that people have to go through when you're first using LLMs. How do you make the prompt? How do you avoid some of the pitfalls that you can come into? So really institutionalizing those key high value add pieces, which through this generator tool, which would allow things like translation of slides, automatic production of a podcast from a slide, for example, generating of speaker notes or ideas from existing content that we have. It leverages that kind of bottom-up view that people have, but also leverages the fact that there is a massive corpus of existing information, be that presentations, documents that every company has over 20 years, and being able to leverage that using these new tools provides a lot of value. And then on the second category, where we approach a much more top-down view, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to use these as parts of the investment process. And Gerald's touched on quite a few there from BlackRock in terms of how we think about text data and signal combination. One of the key areas we focused on is, again, thinking about where the key differentiators or advantages are that we have as a company, and that is in that bottom-up fundamental research team. We have a team of over 130 analysts. They've been producing content on companies for over 40 years. So we have a gigantic corpus of our own proprietary text data that we can actually bring in a similar way that Gerald was talking, where you've got analyst reports, earning calls, all these type of external data, but also supplemented with our internal data, allows the models to learn about the Fidelity way, i.e. how do analysts at Fidelity think and analyze companies? And that can be inferred from all of this text that analysts are producing over the long term. So that's a really interesting way to develop. And the other way, the final example I'll give on that, which is linked to those texts again, is using these tools to get a bit of a feedback loop going with our investment team and with our analysts. The analysts' ratings and the fundamental views are at the core of all of our strategies, be it systematic or discretionary. And we can leverage the text data that the analysts produce on their names to come up with sort of like conviction scores or views, trying to dive into if there's any inconsistencies or incongruencies between the ratings and the views the analysts give and what they actually write and say in the text, in their notes. And that helps us either look into where we might be able to predict ratings downgrades before they might happen, or to give analysts nudges and insights into things that they might not have thought about in either other analysts' notes that cover their names, or things that they've mentioned in their notes that the model thinks are more important than it might have been otherwise. So I think there's lots of use cases there, and we can maybe get into more through the talk, but hopefully that was a useful introduction.
네, 피델리티에서는 크게 그 기존의 업무의 생산성을 향상하는 그런 툴이라는 관점이라 실제로 투자 프로세스에서도 그런 유즈 케이스를 가지고 계시네요. 그래서 적극적으로 그런 툴들을 이제 도입을 하고 계시는데, 좀 이제 두 번째로 넘어가서 아까 이제 제럴드가 많이 그 알파를 만들어내는 부분들을 설명 주시긴 했는데, 조금 더 컴퍼니 와이드에서 그런 블랙락 그런 관점에서 이러한 AI 테크놀로지를 어떤 관점으로 이러한 투자 프로세스라든지 아니면 내부 업무 혁신에 사용하고 있는지 그런 관점들을 조금 더 설명을 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 네.
So we've found, and this is probably consistent with the call it Silicon Valley cultural setting. Our team, even though BlackRock is headquartered in New York and was traditionally a fixed income shop, the systematic team was originally what we call Barclays Global Investors. Actually, it was originally Wells Fargo Asset Management. And the key thing about Wells Fargo is it's actually a bank that was mostly formulated about around the California gold rush in the 1800s and is in San Francisco. So we are deeply, most of the great bulk of our employees and headcount are actually essentially in the center of all that work. So in fact, we tend to treat that as such a rich environment that we don't want to mess around with it too much with top-down direction. So inside the company, inside the group, our approach to new research topics, people always ask, as a senior researcher, I'm actually the head of sustainability research, how do you decide which projects go forward and which don't? And the answer is we don't. We deliberately don't. We essentially use a model that's consistent with the best of actual academia, how it works. If you look at how actual journal articles and research is done, it's ad hoc teams of often young people who come together with common interests and common ideas or complementary skills, and they come up with the ideas, they take the first few steps, and that's how we generate things. New ideas either start from new data that people have identified or simply new ideas someone would want to work on. And if you can induce a few of your colleagues to work with you on an idea, from the perspective of us old people, that's a great start. You folks just go ahead. Our final signal and idea vetting process is very structured and quite tough, but we let people run with their ideas for a long time before we push ourselves in forcibly. We're always available on an advisory basis, but it actually just does mean advisory. So a lot of times the advice will be on the dimension of, well, you might want to try and look at it that way, or gosh, I failed when I tried to do that. It'd be really wonderful if you succeeded, because I wasn't able to do it. And it's been really inspiring to see how well the people have been able to do it. The other thing is that this whole distinction between what we do internally and externally, being in San Francisco, that also is also quite fluid. We have an explicit AI laboratory down in Palo Alto, set just off Stanford University campus, where we actually appropriate the 1 day a week of consulting that Stanford professors are allowed to have, and it's run by the people who wrote the underlying theory and statistics that drive the whole AI world. And so they have then a team of young people, and we often farm out or work with them on our absolutely most difficult technical problems. This is also helpful because these people not only have deep experience in theory and practice of statistics and machine learning, but have also worked with other industries. So they've helped agriculture and energy, and there's, you might imagine, chip manufacturing. The amount of insights that one can get from those other businesses is just enormous. Similarly, as these new LLM companies have come up, we naturally partner. Our San Francisco version of the 40th anniversary featured one of the founders of Anthropic talking to us about what they want to do with Claude. And the wonderful way you can tell somebody's telling you the truth was when somebody that accomplished speaks, as I guess I am now, with a lot of pauses and looking around trying to figure stuff out. That means that he's telling you stuff that's right at the fringe of what he even understands, and he's not just giving you a canned speech that he's given for other people. And so we are blessed to be able to work with leaders in the AI business, both inside the company and outside. Another corpus that we're able to use, which is really quite interesting, most big managers should do it, you might want to think about it, is not only use analysts whose job is actually to select stocks, but use people whose job is to look at companies without the explicit intent of going long or short. At BlackRock, we own a fair amount of the shares of almost every company on the planet. And we have a team, that's two teams actually, that are explicitly dedicated to voting those shares. And so they have analysts who look at those companies exclusively from a corporate governance perspective. And they have a vast amount of information that's delivered entirely from that angle. And precisely because they're not trying to tell you which stocks you should buy or underweight or overweight, they often generate genuinely novel insights that the rest of us would not have thought about. And their information is also in corpus and in text form. And as long as we use old information, most recent stuff is not appropriate to use. Thank you.
Yeah. 블랙락은 세계 최고의 자산운용사답게 그런 새로운 그런 아이디어를 가지는 탤런트들이 어떤 프로젝트를 좀 해볼 수 있게 하고, 또는 이런 LLM, AI와 관련된 가장 엣지에 있는 그런 기술 기업들도 파트너십을 가지고, 또는 그런 정보 자체도 투자한 기업들이 많다 보니까 그런 기업에 대한 정보 레벨들도 더 깊게 접근을 하는 것들이, 모든 이런 부분들이 정보라든지 아이디어, 기술에 대한 접근성들이 가장 엣지에 있고, 그러다 보니까 그런 기술, 정보, 아이디어를 기반으로 계속 이런 좋은 퍼포먼스를 내는 거 아닌가 싶습니다. 네. 이어서 호프만, 이어서 말씀 좀 알리안츠의 그런 내부 그 AI 전략이라든지 도입 현황에 대해서 공유 부탁드리겠습니다.
Sure. First of all, thanks for inviting me and for the delicious lunch we had earlier. So I'm working with the systematic equity group of Allianz Global Investors. Allianz Global Investors is the asset management arm of the Allianz Insurance. And Allianz is one of the top insurances globally, known as being very mature when it comes to AI adoption. And how does that affect our daily lives? So first of all, there's a top-down model governance we have to comply with. And Allianz also very early on installed dedicated functions to handle data and technology in all their operating units, including us. So at the Allianz Global Investors level, we are using AI mainly to improve efficiencies. So we've heard about some use cases on how this could be done. And what has not yet been shared is that it's also very helpful when you write software code. So actually everyone is a coder nowadays. You can just write down your ideas, and very well written code is output by the LLMs. And then there's also other things like drafting client communication, for example. So I'm working within the investment function, equities and investment functions. And our approach to AI is to, whenever we identify a very well-defined problem, we try to find a solution. And our team members have backgrounds in mathematics and physics and engineering, some economists as well. And from the very beginning, when the strategy was founded 26 years ago, we were just been curious about new technologies becoming available. And in the early days, so like the term AI actually is around since the 1950s, I think. Then later it was called statistical learning. Machine learning was one name that was given to this group of algorithms, and nowadays it's called AI or Gen AI or Agentic AI, so many new names. but our philosophy is to use it to solve a very specific problem. And there's some problems that we also solve using ML, which have been discussed before. We have like a random forest, which is a group of decision trees to distill one number that represents the attractiveness of a company out of, and actually we also speak both languages, out of hundreds of features. We also have another term which was not mentioned yet, artificial neural networks, to improve our momentum strategies. Momentum is around for decades, maybe even for centuries, momentum investing. And AI or artificial neural networks give us the opportunity to have nuanced versions of momentum investing, which work better than the classical approach. We also use it for analyzing text, like I have the impression that everyone does. But also here, coming back to the very targeted approach, if you have like an earnings call transcript, for example, you can ask an LLM for sentiment, and the output is human-like. There's not much difference. You can even fine-tune it to have to represent the taste of a specific analyst. That works pretty well. But what you eventually want to do is you want to use it for either risk management or to associate the output of your model with excess returns. Okay, and then there's still, if you go via sentiment, there's still one bridge, or one gap you have to close, namely that sentiment is connected with excess returns. And here, the targeted philosophy comes into play, that you can try to fine-tune or update your model in such a way that it goes all directly to your actual target variable. So to wrap things up, for us, AI, machine learning, statistical learning, however you will call it, is just like the next step of an evolution which is going on for at least 25 years, maybe even more.
네, 말씀 감사합니다. 말씀 중에 그 리서치할 때 코딩할 때 또 LLM 많이 사용한다고 하셨는데, 사실 LLM이 그런 이제 내추럴 랭귀지를 잘 다룸으로써 문서를 요약하고 이런 부분들은 다 공통적으로 사용하는데, 그러한 영역 중에 하나가 또 코딩 언어도, 그것도 이제 어떻게 보면 이제 랭귀지이고 이런 것들이 LLM이 굉장히 잘 다루다 보니까 이런 LLM이 실제로 특정 도메인에서 문제를 푼 영역들이 코딩 영역이고, 최근에 많은 엔지니어들이 LLM을 가지고 모두 이제 코딩을 하는데, 퀀트 파이낸스 영역에서 데이터를 다루고 그리고 이런 걸 분석하려면은 기존의 전통적인 엑셀이라든지 사람이 눈으로 이렇게 데이터를 보면서 이런 것들을 판단할 수 없고, 결국은 많은 데이터를 다룰 때 결국은 이제 코딩이 거기에 인기지가 되는데, 그러한 그 분석하는 프로세스나 방법론들도 이런 LLM을 통해서 좀 개선되는 부분이 있는데, 그런 부분을 또 말씀을 해주신 것 같습니다. 네, 또 이어서 웰링턴 필립에서 또 웰링턴의 그런 사례랑 관점들을 좀 설명을 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to NPS for inviting us to participate in this panel. Very much appreciated. The story at Wellington rhymes in many ways with the stories in the background that you've heard from my counterparts on the panel, from BlackRock and Fidelity and Allianz. Briefly, to introduce Wellington, we're a large global asset management, investment management firm. We manage about $1.3 trillion on behalf of clients around the world. Much of our business is in traditional fundamental asset management. So bottom-up analysis of companies building equity portfolios. Similar for bond markets, and more recently, last 10 years or so, in private markets as well. What is much less known about Wellington, perhaps a little bit like my colleague from Fidelity, is we also have a very long-standing quantitative investment management capability. We've been managing quant portfolios at Wellington for about 35 years now. And I would say that it's that quant investment capability that, by quite some margin, has the greatest experience, fluency, and use of what we now call AI tools. So for many years now, probably close to 20 years now, they were using machine learning to identify patterns and signals in data. Now they use AI models to do that in a more sophisticated way. And they also use AI models for risk assessment, risk analysis, and portfolio construction. So that's a part of our business, and I won't recap on that. That's been touched on very thoroughly by my other panelists. But that's an area where there are current direct uses for AI in managing, building investment portfolios. In the rest of the firm, so the larger part, the more traditional fundamental part, the use of AI models is newer. We rolled out AI models across the firm about 2 years ago now, and very much like the case at Fidelity, looked bottom up to see where they could impact our business, where they could drive efficiency and productivity. And what we have found until recently, and this is now starting to evolve, but until recently, the biggest impact was really in, I guess, softer areas of our business. So content creation, helping with client letters, helping with responses to clients' requests for proposals. And then efficiency gains. So for example, the average time to produce a written note on a meeting has fallen by about 75% through the use of AI models to assist that process. But in the traditional fundamental analysis of companies, so far for many of our investment teams, AI hasn't been as impactful until more recently. Now, there have been some gains that we've seen. So for example, we have an internal research system at Wellington called Mosaic. It holds more than 30 years of internal data, so company meeting notes, company financial models, discussions from investment meetings around the firm that are turned into notes in that system. The investment teams can use an internally developed chatbot that we have, an AI chatbot, to pull information from that internal system, Wellington proprietary information only, and to look at how our views on companies or industries or countries have changed and evolved over time. And that can, in some cases, significantly reduce the research time that you would otherwise have to spend individually looking for notes yourself in that system. So that is producing gains. Until very recently, and I'm talking here just the last 2 months, where it wasn't so useful yet was in really deeply analyzing individual companies, building financial models on those companies based on a future outlook from Wellington's analysts, looking at scenario analysis for those future projections to see what might be a best case and a worst case as well as a base case for those companies. But again, that has recently changed just in the last 2 months at Wellington. We are using an external tool, so we have internal tools, but here we're using a new external tool that ultimately looks like it could be capable of taking the role of junior, earlier career perhaps, research associates. The type of work that would, until very recently, have taken a young research associate a week or maybe 2 weeks to do a detailed deep dive company analysis, that report can now be done in about 40 minutes with this AI system. So it greatly reduces the amount of time needed to prepare a fundamental analyst or a fundamental portfolio to research that company, to understand that business, to then build on that sort of basic investment case that the AI model has provided, and obviously to tweak that as well according to their views. But that use case for AI, which we think will be a very powerful one for many of our fundamental investors, is a newer area where we're starting just now to see impact from AI.
네, 감사합니다. LLM AI를 이용해서 그런 기업에 대한 정보들을 계속 아카이빙하는 속도도 늘어나고, 그리고 그런 것들을 다시 그런 분석에 사용할 수 있도록 하는 그런 걸리는 시간이라든지 방법들도 되게 쉬워지는 것 같습니다. 그런 부분들이 더 좋은 모델을 만들 수 있게 하는 또 하나의 또 경쟁력을 가져다 주는 거 아닌가 싶습니다. 네, 퀀티스의 박성민 이사님 또 이어서 소개 및 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 한국어로 이제 진행을 하겠습니다. 저는 이제 퀀티스에서 리서치 총괄 그리고 CIO로 근무하고 있는 박성민 이사입니다. 잠깐 퀀티밋에 대해서 잠깐 설명드리면, 퀀티밋은 이제 금융공학, 빅데이터, 최근 이제 AI 기술을 이제 통합을 해서 투자 엔진을 만들고 리서치 그리고 퀀트적으로 이제 투자할 수 있는 플랫폼인 핀터를 이제 개발하고, 그것을 이제 금융기관, 국내외 이제 MPS에도 저희가 이제 제공을 하고 있습니다. 저희는 이제 핀터 플랫폼을 통해서 이제 알파를 이제 만들고, 그 알파를 외국 기관들한테 이제 공급을 하고, 그걸 또 기관들이 요청하는 어떤 특정 포트폴리오를 이제 커스터마이즈해서 그것을 이제 제공하는 비즈니스를 펼치고 있습니다. 저희는 이제 이런 비즈니스를 이제 퀀트 에저 서비스, 카스라고 이제 불리고 있는데요. 저희는 이제 좀 스케일러블한 알파를 이제 찾는 걸 이제 목표를 두고 있고, 최근에는 이제 AI 기술이 이제 에이전트 쪽으로 넘어옴에 따라서 저희는 이제 저희가 기존에 축적했던 이제 그런 데이터들, 그리고 퀀트적인 뭐 테스팅 툴, 뭐 애트리뷰션, 컨트리뷰션 이런 모든 이제 분석 툴들을 AI, LLM 기술들이 이제 사용할 수 있는 MCP 프레임워크로 이제 그렇게 묶어서 기관들이 본인들이 원하는 에이전트를 만들 수 있게끔 그런 툴을 제공하는데도 저희가 지금 총력을 다하고 있습니다. 저희가 이제 기본적으로 AI에 대해서 접근하는 방향은 크게 세 가지로 이제 압축을 할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 첫 번째는 이제 기존 저희가 운영해왔던 이제 퀀트 투자 플랫폼 위에서 AI를 이제 입히는 AI 어그멘테이션 이제 단계입니다. 이제 기존 이제 여기 계셨던 뭐 블랙락이든 웰링턴, 피델리티 이제 업무 프로세스 위에 기존의 이제 업무 프로세스 워크플로우에 AI를 이제 접목함으로써 이제 프로덕티비티 뭐 그리고 인텔리전스를 입히는 과정인데요. 특히 이제 저희 같은 핀터 이제 플랫폼 위에서 알파를 만드는 이제 퀀티티 입장에서는 이제 특히 전략을 만들 때 저희는 이제 다 파이썬 기반 코딩 베이스로 이제 진행을 합니다. 근데 이 과정에서 이제 LLM 에이전트 기반으로 이제 도입이 되면서 저희가 실제 퀀트 리서처가 코딩하는 비율이 거의 한 10%, 즉 이제 AI가 코딩을 대체하는 게 거의 90% 가까이 지금 진행이 되어 있고요. 그리고 특히 이제 저희는 이제 좀 이런 대형사와 달리 이제 저희는 좀 실험적인 핀테크 기업이다 보니까 최신 에이전트 기술인 뭐 클라우드의 코드나 아니면 GPT 이제 코덱스 같은 이제 자동화 에이전트 이제 코딩 기술을 이제 이용해서 이제 논 크리티컬한 그런 프레임워크 그리고 인프라 빌딩에서는 그렇게 LLM 기반으로 저희가 많이 사용을 하고 있습니다. 두 번째 기조인 저희 AI를 이제 접목하는 방식은 저희 시스템적인 프레임워크 위에 사람이 휴먼 매니저가 자기만의 인투이션을 가지고 어떤 입력값을 넣고 싶다 이럴 때 저희가 그런 하이브리드 어프로치를 이제 접근을 하고 있습니다. 예를 들어서 뭐 어떤 특정 매니저가 자기 포트폴리오의 어떤 해치 비율을 조정하고 싶다. 근데 이 뷰는 특정 매니저의 직관에서 나온 뷰라고 한다면은 기존 운영되고 있던 퀀트적인 시스템적인 알고리즘적인 포트폴리오 위에 그 포트폴리오에 인투이션을 담아서 새로운 포트폴리오를 운영할 수 있게끔 저희가 그렇게 지원을 하는 방향으로 지금 이제 진행을 하고 있습니다. 이제 마지막으로는 저희가 풀스택 AI 오토노머스라는 이제 비전을 가지고 지금 저희 회사가 전력으로 이제 투자를 하고 있는 분야인데, 이 분야는 데이터 수집, 분석, 그리고 알파 피처 생성, 그리고 피처 분석, 전략 생성, 전략 테스팅, 전략 밸리데이션, 그리고 디시스 생성까지, 그리고 이런 것들을 이제 레페티티브하게 각각 에이전트들이 서로 이제 리뷰하고 분석하고 이게 맞는지 틀리는지 이걸 A to G까지 100% AI가 전부 진행하는 것을 저희가 이제 테스팅을 하고 있고, 저희 목표는 일정 부분 이런 저희 퀀트 기반 리서처가 만든 알파를 어느 정도 이상 비팅하는 것을 목표를 하고 지금 개발을 하고 있습니다. 네, 감사합니다.
네, 말씀 감사합니다. 지금 총 5개 기관의 그런 내부적인 AI 툴 기술에 대한 접목 현황, 그리고 이 AI를 어떻게 다루고 있는지 바라보고 있는지 설명을 들어봤는데, 공통적인 부분들은 있는 것 같습니다. 일단 기본적으로 AI에 대해서 적극적으로 도입해서 이용을 하고 계시고, 그리고 그게 이제 두 가지 카테고리에서 이루어지는데, 내부의 업무 프로세스 차원에서 실제로 이것들의 생산성을 향상하는 것들, 특히 그런 텍스트 데이터를 가지고 어떤 보고서를 쓰거나 아니면 텍스트를 이해하거나 이런 기본의 이제 리서치를 하거나 세일즈를 할 때 그런 이제 문서를 만들고 문서를 해석하는 툴로서 이용하는 것들이 공통적인 부분들이 좀 보이고요. 그리고 이런 자산운용사의 본질적인 그런 엣지인 자산운용에 있어서 알파를 만들거나 포트폴리오를 생성하거나 옵티마이제이션하거나 새로운 데이터셋에서 인사이트를 발굴하는데도 이러한 AI 기술들을 굉장히 적극적으로 도입하는 모습을 볼 수 있겠습니다. 네, 전체 회사에 대해서 이런 상황들 들어봤는데 저희가 지금 요즘 시대, 그러니까 한국이 보면은 GPT를 미국 다음으로 제일 많이 사용하는 회사로 지금 제일 많이 사용하는 국가인데 그만큼 한국이 굉장히 그런 LLM이라든지 AI들이 친숙하게 일상에 들어와 있는데 이러한 부분들이 점차 더 저변화가 되고 익숙해지고 하다 보면은 과연 그 AI가 사람이 갖고 있는 지능이라든지 숙련성 이상의 그런 것들을 가지는 상황에서 자산운용업 안에서 기존의 전문가의 영역이었던 데이터를 모으고 분석하고 이걸 기반으로 해서 알파를 끊임없이 찾아내고 포트폴리오 옵티마이제이션해서 실제로 트레이딩으로 임플리메이션하는 그런 일련의 파이프라인이 결국은 사람이 아니고 일정 부분은 AI가 대체하는 영역이 있지 않을까, 또는 이런 AI, LLM이 지금 AGI를 통해서 더 발전을 하고 있는데 더 어드밴스가 된다면 지금까지 한 3년까지의 그런 발전, 태생부터 발전까지, 대비부터 발전까지의 속도만큼 또 발전을 하다 보면은 조만간 또 AGI 시대가 올 수가 있는데 그렇게 되면은 이런 휴먼 매니저, 이 오랜 기간 자산운용 업계에서의 그런 그 밸류 체인에 있어서 핵심 역할을 했던 휴먼 매니저의 역할들이 좀 변화가 있지 않을까라는 생각이 있습니다. 그래서 그런 관점에서도 이런 각각의 회사에서 어떤 좀 이제 어떻게 내다보는지 그리고 어떻게 역할들을 구성하고 있는지에 대한 의견들이 있으실 텐데요. 그 부분들을 또 각 회사별로 좀 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 피델리티에서 말씀해 주실까요?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very good point. I mean, we've seen, I think, some consensus here already that some of the lower level investment jobs and research and data processing is already at the level which it can be replaced. And I think we're already also seeing, we're not yet seeing the slowdown that people expected in the development and improvement of these models. They burst onto the scene a few years ago, and the big question was, how far can it go? And so far, through bigger models or more intelligent changes, things like agentic thinking models that different companies are coming out with, we're seeing more and more advancement in the space. So I think you're going to see that trend continue, that sort of higher value-added processes will be more likely to be able to be not necessarily replaced, but augmented with AI. And that's how we think about it in Fidelity, is that there clearly are some jobs in some areas that AI can fully replace, but in the investment management space, at the moment, it's at the level where augmenting and helping improve the way you think about or the way we look at data is the easiest solutions we can look at. And some of that comes from the skill of the models themselves. Financial markets very complex. There's a lot of things to look at. Other just comes from the maturity of technology of existing or vendor companies, for example. So getting all your vendor data from third parties available and into your LLM is still a massive undertaking and will take years. Anthropic have worked a lot on this over the last 12 months and started to come up with more standardized approaches of how LLMs will take in data, and something like that could help accelerate the speed at which we can see more sophisticated roles being undertaken. But I think for the short term, I very much see this as still being an augmentation to existing investment roles.
네, 감사합니다. 제럴드, 블랙락에서는 어떻게 생각하시는지 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
So first one, I don't know about you, but I often struggle to understand exactly what people mean by agentic AI and what exactly that can do. We've actually found it very helpful to, or at least I find it helpful to just go back to, the origins of coding, which is binary on-off, or just breaking things up that were once one into two. That was actually our very first LLM-driven stock picking approach. It's really straightforward, and as you probably know, the reason I'm doing the two is, as you know, once you have two, then you do two more, and off you go. Then you have a computer. It turns out if you just ask any of the LLMs which stock to buy, you'll basically just get what's most popular. This is not a great approach. It turns out you get an extraordinary amount from simply having two little specialized agents. And again, you can move on from there to N. But the first one, you just ask the agent, you don't tell it you're asking about investments, you just ask it, what are the most important developments in the world right now? Don't tell them it's about investments. It'll give you a beautiful, right, summary of that. And then say, okay, given that, which stocks would you go long and short? Right? It's the most basic extension, and it's really been quite powerful. And you can see the point, and once you've broken it up into two and you've got it broken down, and these are basically two agents, right? One of them is the scenario and the thematic person, and the other one is the allocator. Off they go, and you can just break it down and run from that. So I hope that's helpful almost for just, oftentimes it's very hard to bring this stuff down to earth. And so we've found that quite useful. And again, once you've got the two, you're already in the land of coding. Interestingly, I'll also give you an interesting anecdote. One place where we've actually found, I'll give you one success and one failure. Not only can AI write code, when we evaluate people's research, we've found it extremely valuable to do the opposite. Because at the end of the day, right, we have reports and talk, and we even talk internally, but at the end of the day, at least for a quant process, the trades and the holdings are driven by code. And even a signal is driven by code. And so it's incredibly powerful. You should just do this also because it's often sometimes actually quite funny. Give the LLM the code and ask it to tell you in English or in whatever your language is what it's doing. It often takes away a lot of the fancy talk that we have, because there's a lot of fancy labels that stock analysts apply. Oh, I'm talking about improved labor productivity, and the LLM will tell you, really, you're taking revenues and dividing it by headcount. Okay, it's very clarifying and actually quite truth-telling. The one place, and here I would actually love your help. We've also been trying to understand better how traditional valuation models work. Traditional analysts, and these are essentially Excel spreadsheets, right? Where you'll have the analysts will generate some revenue forecasts and all the other items will be populated. We have not had huge success in letting an LLM crack the code on that. Any of you who have played with spreadsheet know that what you're really looking for is one or two key formulas that are embedded in that little formula bar in Excel that really drive the answer, right? Did somebody accidentally stick in a margin of 90%? Or deliberately stick in a margin of 90%. And we haven't yet had much success in having it say, yeah, blah, blah, that's where the answer comes from. So if anybody has any ideas on that, we'd love to hear them.
오케이. 감사합니다. 네, 이어서 알리안체 요르크 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
When I started in the industry, one of my first projects was to evaluate patents. In Europe, it's a pain to collect patents, as it is with most of the data items from official sources, because there's so many different companies, not all of them complying to the same standard. But in the US, it's very easy. You can just download all the patent filings, and it was an overwhelming experience. I learned a lot. For example, I learned there's a German company, so my home country, that has a patent for a machine that automatically slices sausages. So that was quite fun to learn. What I didn't like is, and we heard that before, is companies tend to hide their identities when they file patents. Sometimes they are hiding behind another company's name, or they hide behind a research institution. And my job was to build a mapping to the IDs or the tickers we use to identify companies typically. And this took me weeks to come up with a solution which was not perfect. And this doesn't need to be done in the future anymore, because the AI, the LLMs can just do it for you. If you upload a patent, it can, with a very high likeliness, give you the right ticker which is connected to it. And this brings me to the point that I wanted to make is AI frees us from repetitive, boring tasks and open up some opportunities to spend much more time on value-creating tasks that will, in the end, help to improve the investment outcome.
Thank you. Yeah. Philip?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that comment about the opportunity for AI models to enhance humans' ability to do their jobs, make them more efficient, more effective, give them more time to spend on higher level investment decisions. For now, and probably for the near-term foreseeable future, I don't think we're yet in a world where AI will replace a fundamental traditional portfolio manager in an active strategy. We may well get to that world, but even then, I would say at the end of the day, fundamental investment management is inherently making predictions about the future. Which companies do I think will do better? Which companies do I think will do worse? Build a portfolio. I think we'll get to a world where an AI can absolutely form those opinions, but will it do that better, more effectively than a human? We don't yet know. And I would argue that a very capable human portfolio manager might be just as good about those predictions of the future as an AI model might become over the coming years. So for now, a great complement. In the future, perhaps a competitor, but I don't see a world, at least not yet, where there will be no need for humans to be involved in investment management.
감사합니다. 네. 성민님, 예, 이어서.
네. 처음에 이제 블랙락 제럴드께서 이제 그린올드 칸의 그 액티브 매니지먼트 그 책을 소개해 주셨는데 그 책의 핵심은 Law of Active Management라는 이제 그 공식에 있습니다. 공식이 알파는 결국 이 인사이트, 인포메이션 코에피션트로 나오는 휴먼 매니저의 인사이트와 그리고 breadth, number of independent bets를 이제 곱한 값이 알파인데 discretionary portfolio manager 같은 경우는 이제 이런 인사이트, 인포메이션 코에피션트가 이제 높은 편이고 저희 같이 이제 100% 시스테매틱, 알고리드믹 포트폴리오 매니저 쪽에서는 이제 breadth, 즉 이제 커버리지가 이제 많고 이렇게 많이 이제 퀀트적으로 접근할 경우 그 수치가 이제 높은 값이 나오고 있습니다. 근데 이제 AI가 이제 LLM 특히 LLM이 이제 등장하고 나서 이 두 개 사이에 접점이 이제 한 점으로 뭉쳐지고 있는 이제 그게 이제 보여지는데요. 각 회사마다 앞서 이제 말씀드렸다시피 여러 가지 이제 프로세스에 본인만의 이제 그런 프로프라이터리 데이터도 있고 워크플로우에 이제 각종 AI들을 이제 도입하고 자기만의 방식으로 이제 AI를 전복하고 계시는데 이게 이제 시스템적인 포트폴리오 매니저 입장이나 아니면은 휴먼 매니저 위주의 그런 매니저 입장에서도 다 AI를 도입하고 있기 때문에 기존 이제 인포메이션 코에피션트이 높았던 분들은 이제 커버리지가 높아지는 거고 브레드가 높아지는 거고 저희 같이 이제 알고리드믹 드리븐 포트폴리오 매니저 입장에서는 LLM 기술이 등장하면서 좀 더 인사이트풀한 그런 딥하게 이제 분석을 할 수 있다는 이제 그런 게 있기 때문에 저는 뭐 AI가 우선이냐 아니면 휴먼 매니저가 우선이냐가 아니라 둘이 이제 함께 같이 가는 방향으로 그렇게 진행된다고 생각이 됩니다. 이제 두 번째로는 기존 AI 특히 LLM 기술이 나오기 이전부터 저희 퀀틱 같은 회사도 머신러닝이나 딥러닝으로 이제 쉽게 보여지지 않는 레이턴트 베리에이블이라고 이제 불러지는 이제 즉각 계산이 되지 않는 그런 피처들을 많이 발굴하고 이제 거기서 이제 알파를 이제 많이 찾았는데 기존 이제 퀀트적으로 이제 접근하는 매니저 입장에서는 이 약점 중에 하나가 이제 스트럭처럴 브레이크, 레짐이 바뀌었을 때 그것을 빨리 디텍트하고 그런 것들이 이제 퀀트적으로는 좀 약점인 부분이 있는데 그런 부분에 있어서는 이제 여전히 AI의 도움을 받은 휴먼 매니저가 앞으로도 좀 강세를 보이지 않을까 생각이 되고요. 이제 마지막으로는 이제 인과적 추론 분야에서 이제 LLM 기술이 이제 도입이 되면서 기존에 설명할 수 없었던 인과적 추론 방식에서 이제 다이렉티드 acyclic 그래프라는 DAG 그래프라는 이제 분석 방식이나 이제 여러 가지 이제 피처에 대해서 다시 한번끔 인과적 코절 인퍼런스 관점에서 기존 알파들을 다시 재구성하고 리컨디셔닝하고 또 새롭게 이제 리패키징할 수 있다는 점에서 되게 AI 기술이 이제 가져다주는 그런 이점들이 너무 많기 때문에 앞으로 AI와 이제 휴먼 매니저들의 이 우위를 이제 가르기보다는 서로 인터랙션하는 방향으로 앞으로 많이 진행이 될 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
네. 여러분들의 말씀을 종합해 보면은 아직 이제 AI 기술만으로 이제 자산 운용을 할 수는 없고 기존의 이제 휴먼 매니저들이 AI 기술을 활용해서 훨씬 더 생산성을 높이거나 좋은 모델을 만들 수 있는 약간 어그멘티드된 형태 또는 인파워링하는 형태로 툴을 지금 바라보고 계시는 것 같습니다. 지금 전체적으로 그 AI 기술을 어떻게 도입하고 어떻게 활용하고 있는지 어떻게 바라보시는지 관점에서 좀 말씀을 나눴는데요. 이 AI 기술들이 앞으로 더 발전되고 접목되면서 AI 자체가 지금 현재 이제 블랙박스 형태로 실제로 AI 안에서는 어떻게 로지컬리 판단이 일어나고 그 판단 결과 그러한 프로세스에 따라서 결과가 나오는지를 알 수가 없기 때문에 굉장히 AI를 접목하는 거에 있어서 금융 투자에 있어서는 코잘리티라고 하나요? 인과관계들을 분석할 수 없는 그리고 이제 반복성이라든지 이런 것들이 좀 개런티가 안 되는 문제들이 현재 있는데 이런 것들로 인해서 실제로 AI를 투자 프로세스에 접근하는 데 있어서 좀 리스크라든지 불확실성 요인들이 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 지금 여러 파트에서 AI를 접목하고 있는데 그런 부분에 있어서 이러한 불확실성들을 어떻게 다루면서 실제로 리스크 관리를 하면서 접목을 하시는지 또 말씀을 좀 부탁드려 보려고 합니다. 지금 시간이 혹시 얼마 정도 남았을까요? 저희 세션이 네 50분 10분밖에 안 남았군요. 그러면은 몇 분께만 좀 말씀을 부탁드려 보겠습니다. 예. 블랙락에서는 현재 그러한 이제 AI 기술을 접목해서 만드는 여러 모델에 대해서 불확실성 통제 이런 것들을 어떻게 하고 계시는지 좀 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
First one is really by being clear and not worrying about things that we can't control. The first thing I would say is the two issues that were touched on at the end. Oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you. The two things that were touched on at the end actually indicate two things that we try not to worry too much about, and it's actually a lot of the machine learning community is also quite happy about this. The first one is the causality thing. Our job is actually prediction. You see that quite clearly in working with our stewardship colleagues, because their job is to tell a company to do something and hope it changes things. Our job is to simply take companies the way they are and try and predict which will do better or worse. So for us, really worrying too much about causality is probably a trap. When you say it's a signal, it says that this company is doing what it's doing, and our job is simply to uncover it. And I think that actually helps quite a bit. And in terms of whether it's a black box or not, I think one thing we should always be comfortable being uncomfortable with that, because even the people who are at the very forefront of the AI and machine learning are having this debate. They call this the interpretability concern. And I think it's really quite productive that we are comfortable that a lot of times we can't exactly say why or how the machine came up with its answer, because if we could do that, then it really isn't adding any value to us. So we should almost be comfortable with the mystery. And in fact, what we often do is I call it machine teaching. Say the machine found something, and sometimes you can slap your forehead and say, oh my God, that's why it did it. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from you, the machine.
말씀 감사합니다. 한 분 더 말씀을 들어보면 좋을 것 같은데요. 웰링턴에서는 어떻게 그런 리스크 관리를 하시는지 필립 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Great, thank you. So at the end of the day at Wellington, what I think it boils down to is AI is not implementing any investment decision or any trade. So for all of our portfolios, including our quant portfolios, there's a human, a portfolio manager, who is reviewing the inputs, reviewing the analysis. It may come from an AI, it may come from a traditional analyst, and determining if they want to own that stock, not own that stock. Same for credit portfolios in fixed income space, and sending a trade order to our trading desk. Now, all of that process can be aided by AI, but for now, at least at Wellington, no AI is making that final decision on any aspect of the investment approach.
네, 결국은 사람이 최종적으로 판단해서 그 AI가 만들어내는 결과들을 활용함으로써 사람이 판단을 최종적으로 함으로써 리스크 관리를 하시는 부분에 대해서 말씀을 드렸습니다. 전체적으로 AI 기술을 툴로서 지금 활용을 하다 보니까 사람이 그런 걸 AI 기술을 활용해서 그런 투자에 대한 판단을 최종적으로 내리는데 방점을 가지고 아직은 운용을 하고 있는 것 같습니다. 이게 지금 AI 기술이 들어온 지 이제 3년 차 정도가 됐고 그 전부터 데이터들이 이제 전산화가 되고 퀀트적인 기법들은 많이 발전했지만 LLM이 직접적으로 이제 들어와서 이런 AI 기술로 좀 소구가 되면서 자산운용 업계에 들어온 것들은 불과 2, 3년밖에 안 됐는데 2025년 현 시점에서는 어그멘티드 된 툴로서 또는 인파워링하는 툴, 생산성을 향상하는 툴로서 접목이 되어 있다라고 볼 수 있을 것 같고 아마 7회차, 8회차 이런 지니 포럼이 계속되면서 기술 발전과 환경 변화에 따라서 또 다른 모습이 또 펼쳐지지 않을까라는 생각이 들긴 합니다. 네, 마지막으로 시간이 좀 제약되어서 마지막으로 질문 하나를 또 드리도록 하겠습니다. 지금 올해로서 6회차 지니 포럼이 열리고 있는데 글로벌 금융 투자에서 금융도 이제 여러 가지 분야가 있고 이 지니 포럼은 자산운용, 투자와 관련된 자산운용이라는 분야에 있어서 이 전주에서 이렇게 이루어지고 있는데 전주가 또는 이 충북도가 이러한 글로벌 자산운용 그 씬 안에서 이러한 새로운 그런 기술이라든지 어떤 혁신들을 이뤄가는 거점이 되기 위해서 어떠한 부분들을 하면 좋을지에 대한 그런 아이디어들 아니면 뭔가 레퍼런스가 되는 모델들이 있는지를 한번 좀 얘기를 나눠보고 싶습니다. 관련해서 알리안체 유르크님 혹시 그 관련된 의견이라든지 아이디어 있으면 좀 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
I can share an example from back from Europe, and it's Munich. So you might have heard of the Oktoberfest, which just started, but Munich is also well known for being a tech hub. And how did that evolve? So historically there always have been some high-tech companies like BMW and Siemens, but in more recent years this was heavily supported by the government, namely by the introduction of university excellence clusters. So Germany is very decentralized. There's many centers. The automobile production in the south, Frankfurt is the financial hub, and the government is steering this development of excellent clusters by giving research grants to universities. In particular, Munich has two top-tier universities, the Technical University of Munich and the LMU. And the proof that it actually works to have all the excellence, all the talents in one place is that when IBM, International Business Machine, who have been leading in AI since the 60s and are still very active in the AI business, decided to move their European hub into Munich, exactly because of the deep talent pool which is available. On top of that, there's close collaboration between the companies in Munich and the universities. For example, we collaborate with the financial mathematics department of the Technical University, which gives the young people who come to this area the opportunity to get in contact with companies very early on. So it's a combination. You need to offer the right educational services, like top universities, and if then also on top, companies offer the young talents the opportunity to join very early on. This might help to develop a region or a city into a hub for a certain area, for a certain technology.
민현의 그런 산학 연계 케이스가 하나의 또 모델로서 될 수 있다라는 말씀을 주셨는데 지금 관련해서 저도 이제 추가적으로 좀 제 의견을 드리자면 결국 그 AI 기술은 사실 소프트웨어이기 때문에 전 세계 어디서든지 쓸 수 있습니다. 물론 서울뿐만 아니라 전주, 전 세계 어디서든지 그런 건 접근성은 동일한데, 이 전주가 갖고 있는 장점은 국민연금 또는 이러한 글로벌 자산운용사들이 실제로 이쪽에서 비즈니스를 하고 있기 때문에 자산운용 업계에서 풀고자 하는 여러 가지 문제들, 이러한 프로블럼 데피니션들을 할 수가 있고, 그리고 전주에 있는 로컬 그런 지역 대학들의 그런 탤런트들과 연계가 돼서 자산운용 업계가 어떤 오픈 프로블럼을 제시하고, 그리고 이런 대학이 그런 인더스트리에서 필요한 프로블럼을 이런 AI 기술을 이용해서 같이 풀어보는 그런 트레이닝 과정들, 아니면 파이프라인을 만들고, 그런 것들이 전주에 있는 대학과 이런 수요 기관들이 거점이 돼서 서울에 있는 대학들, 아니면 글로벌리 있는 대학들을 연계해서 글로벌 AI 에셋 인베스트먼트 해커톤을 만든다든지, 이런 식으로 계속 그런 프로그램들을 만들어 가면서 관심도 끌어내고 실제로 인더스트리 프로블럼을 푸는 케이스들을 만들어 간다면은 그런 것들이 또 하나의 또 자산이 돼서 자산 운용에 대한 거점이 되는 또 도시로 만들어 볼 수 있지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 관련해서 저도 조금 더 이제 회사와 관련된 말씀을 드리면, 퀀티스는 그러한 이제 데이터 기반으로 퀀터티브한 모델링을 하고, 그런 모델 가지고 자산 운용을 할 수 있는 플랫폼 기술을 갖고 있는데요. 이런 기술을 가지고 서울대학교랑 제휴를 하고 카이스트랑 제휴를 하고, 최근에는 그 뉴욕대 스턴대랑 이제 제휴를 했고, 조만간 또 이제 싱가포르 국립대라든지 글로벌 탑티어 대학들이랑 제휴를 해나갈 예정입니다. 저희가 이제 하려고 하는 거는 결국은 학생들이 필요한 것들은 제대로 된 그 인더스트리 프로블럼 데피니션이 뭔지, 그리고 이런 것들을 풀기 위해서 어떠한 데이터셋이 어떻게 접근 가능한지, 그런 데이터에 대한 액세스를 열어드리고 퀀터티브하게 리서치할 수 있는 플랫폼을 제공해드리면, 이러한 탤런트들이 굉장히 액티브하게 집중력 있게 리서치를 하고 학습을 하면서 산업에 대한 경험도 하고, 또 특정 케이스 같은 경우는 굉장히 인사이트한 아이디어들을 여기서 모아가지고 다시 인더스트리에 공급할 수 있는 파이프라인을 만들 수 있다는 것들을 저희들은 만들어가고 있습니다. 그래서 그런 부분들을 조금 더 넓혀서 전주에 있는 대학이라든지 지자체 또는 이런 글로벌 자산운용사들이랑 컨소시엄을 맺어가지고 호플리 내년이나 후년에는 그런 해커톤들, 글로벌 해커톤을 또 만들어보면 어떨까라는 그런 아이디어도 있습니다. 네. 시간이 다 돼서 오늘 좀 전체 세션에 대한 내용들을 서머라이즈하고 매짐을 하도록 하겠습니다. AI는 자산운용에서 지금 기본적인 툴로 들어와 있습니다. 그것들은 모든 기관들이 확인해 주셨고, 하지만 그 툴이 사람의 역량을 대체하는 단계는 아닙니다. 사람의 역량을 인파워링 하지만 대체하는 단계는 아니고, 근데 개발 영역, 코딩 영역에서는 이미 많은 엔지니어들의 역량들이 AI 툴로 대체되면서 주니어 엔지니어들이 설 자리들이 없어졌습니다. 하지만 아직 자산운용 업계에서는 그 정도까지는 아니지만 로우 레벨에서부터 그러한 루틴한 일들이라든지 데이터 처리, 기본적인 분석들은 아마 대체될 것으로 보이고, 특정 시점에는 아마 피어가 되는 수준까지도 올 거로 전망이 되어 보입니다. 여기 있는 글로벌 기관들도 계속 그런 가능성을 보고 기술들을 도입하고 계속 그 방향으로 그러한 생산성 향상, 그리고 투자에 대한 프로세스 향상, 수익률 향상들을 지향을 하고 있기 때문에 그런 시대가 올 거라고 보이고 있고, 하지만 여전히 사람이 지금 굉장히 중요한 시점이다라고 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그리고 사람이 그 최종 그 디시전 메이킹 단계에 있기 때문에 AI를 도입함으로써 생기는 여러 가지 문제들이 시장에 번지지는 않을 것이다. 그러한 블랙박스 형태의 모델들이 막 운용을 하면서 시장에 크래시를 일으키거나 그런 형태로 발전되진 않을 거다. 아직은 컨트롤블하다라는 것들이 현재 시점에서 2025년 현재 이제 9월 시점에서 LLM 기술, AI 기술들이 자산운용에 접목된 현황인 것 같습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 전주가 이런 충북도가 그리고 국민연금이 글로벌 그런 자산운용에 있어서 허브가 되기 위해서는 그런 지역에 있는 그런 로컬 대학과 그리고 여기 있는 그런 자산운용사들의 인더스트리 프로블럼들을 모아서 이것들을 이어주는 어떤 허브 역할들을 해나가면은 이렇게 이제 훌륭하신 전문가들이 모여서 이렇게 1년에 한 번씩 세션하는 거 외에 조금 더 컨텐츠가 있고 조금 더 지속성이 있는 그런 부분들도 만들어 볼 수 있지 않을까라고 함께 또 제안을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네. 이상으로 장시간 발표 및 토론을 해주신 패널 분들께 감사 인사드립니다. 이것으로 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
이제 저희 마무리하면서 사진 촬영하면서 마무리를 하도록 하죠. Before we wrap up the session, let's take a photo. Yes, please. 네, 앞쪽으로 모시겠습니다. 자, 이번 세션에 또 다양한 의견과 제언들을 함께 해주셨는데요. 저희 사진 촬영하면서 마무리를 하도록 하겠습니다. Alright. 네, 이번 세션에서 정말 열심히 또 참여를 해주셨는데요. 여러분 함께 해주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 큰 박수 보내주시기 바랍니다. 네, 이렇게 사진 촬영을 끝으로 모든 순서를 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 컨퍼런스를 통해서 이 급변하는 시대에 보다 적극적으로 대응하기 위한 우리의 노력에 대해서 보다 자세하게 이야기 나누셨길 바랍니다. 소중한 인사이트 되셨길 바라면서 전북국제금융컨퍼런스 모든 순서는 여기서 인사드리겠습니다. 저희는 지금부터 잠시 휴식 후에 이어서 3시 40분부터 금융혁신 세미나로 다시 돌아오겠습니다. 휴식 후에 3시 40분에 다시 뵙겠습니다. 고맙습니다.